Have you ever wondered how one man's lies could fool an entire nation and create a scam so notorious that it still bears his name a century later? Well, buckle up, because today we're diving into the absolutely wild story of Charles Ponzi, the financial mastermind who wasn't actually a mastermind at all, but somehow managed to convince thousands of people to hand over their life savings based on nothing more than smooth talking and impossible promises. This isn't just another boring financial history lesson. This is the story of how a broke Italian immigrant with a criminal record became one of America's most celebrated business geniuses, lived like a king for months, and then watched it all come crashing down in spectacular fashion. And here's the kicker. The entire operation was built on something as simple as postage stamps. Yes, you heard that right. Postage stamps. But before we get to the juicy details of how Ponzi pulled off one of history's most audacious financial frauds, let me paint you a picture of just how insane this whole thing was. Picture this: crowds of people literally lining up around city blocks, begging a man to take their money. Newspapers calling him a financial genius. Investors getting 50% returns in just 45 days. It sounds too good to be true, right? That's because it absolutely was. The man behind this chaos wasn't some Wall Street wizard or Harvard-educated financier. He was Charles Ponzi, a guy who had already been to prison twice, couldn't hold down a regular job, and whose grand business plan involved exploiting tiny price differences in international postage coupons. And yet, for a brief moment in time, he had the entire financial world eating out of his hands. So how did a serial failure with a criminal background manage to convince thousands of intelligent people to trust him with their money? How did he go from sleeping in parks and begging for food to living in a mansion and wearing diamond pins? And most importantly, how did his scheme become so infamous that we still use his name to describe similar frauds today? The answers to these questions reveal not just the story of one man's incredible deception, but also expose the timeless human weaknesses that make all of us vulnerable to scams, even today. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The same psychological tricks that Ponzi used in 1920 are still being used by fraudsters right now, just with different wrapping paper. Let's start at the beginning, with a young man who felt the world owed him something it wasn't willing to give. Charles Ponzi entered the world in 1882 in Italy, and from day one, he felt cheated by life. His father worked as a postman, and while the family wasn't poor, they weren't rich either. But here's what really ate at young Charles. His family used to be somebody. His grandparents and great-grandparents had been successful merchants, businessmen, even public officials. The family had fallen from grace, and Charles couldn't stand it. From childhood, Charles was consumed with this burning question. Why should he have to work for a living when other people were born into wealth? Why couldn't he just skip all the hard work and go straight to the good life? This resentment would shape everything that came after. When Charles was a teenager, his father died, leaving him a modest inheritance. His mother had dreams of sending him to a prestigious university, hoping education would lift him back into the upper class where she felt the family belonged. But Charles had very different plans for that money. Instead of studying, Charles decided to live like the wealthy young man he believed he should have been born as. He spent his inheritance on the finest clothes, ate at the most expensive restaurants, attended the opera, and gambled at casinos with rich friends who had no idea he was basically a fraud. Charles was playing a character, pretending to be something he wasn't and loving every minute of it. But here's the thing about playing pretend with money. Eventually, the money runs out. And when Charles's inheritance disappeared, so did his fake lifestyle. He had learned nothing at university because he'd never actually attended classes. His wealthy friends weren't interested in helping someone who was actually broke. And suddenly, the young man who thought he was too good for regular work found himself with no choice but to do exactly that. Faced with the prospect of getting a clerk job, which he considered beneath him, Charles made a decision that would define his entire life. He would go to America, strike it rich, and return to Italy as the wealthy man he'd always believed he deserved to be. In his mind, America was the land of opportunity, where clever people could make fortunes quickly. He had no plan, no skills, and no money, but he had absolute confidence that somehow he'd figure it out. In 1903, Charles arrived in Boston with big dreams and empty pockets. Reality hit him like a brick wall. There was no inheritance to fall back on, no family connections to help him, and no magic formula for getting rich quick. If he wanted to eat, he had to work. And work he did, though not very well. Over the next few years, Charles bounced from job to job up and down the East Coast. He painted signs, waited tables, worked in grocery stores, washed dishes, labored in factories, sold insurance, and fixed sewing machines. But he couldn't stick with anything. Either he'd quit because he hated the work, or he'd get fired for trying to cheat customers or steal from his employers. This led to some pretty desperate times. Charles often found himself homeless, sleeping in parks, begging for food, and stealing when he could get away with it. It was a far cry from his fantasy of the easy American fortune, and it definitely wasn't the success story he wanted to write home about to his mother. But even during his lowest moments, Charles never lost his taste for the high life. Whenever he managed to scrape together a few dollars, he'd blow it all on a fancy dinner or a weekend trip, trying to recapture that feeling of being wealthy, even if it was just for a night. He was addicted to living above his means, even when he had no means at all. In 1907, Charles decided to try his luck in Canada. He found work at a bank in Montreal called Banco Zarossi, which primarily served Italian immigrants. Finally, it seemed like things might be looking up. He had a steady job, a regular paycheck, and a chance to use his language skills and cultural knowledge. But Charles had unknowingly stumbled into his first real education in financial fraud. His boss, Zarossi, was running a classic scam. He was using money from new depositors to pay interest to older depositors, which allowed him to offer interest rates that were double what other banks were offering. It was the old rob Peter to pay Paul trick, and it worked beautifully until it didn't. When customers started getting suspicious about why their families back in Italy weren't receiving the money transfers the bank promised to send, authorities began investigating. Zarossi saw the writing on the wall, packed a suitcase with as much cash as he could carry, and fled to Mexico, leaving his employees to face the consequences. Now, a smart person would have learned from this experience and stayed far away from anything that seemed too good to be true. But Charles wasn't smart in that way. Instead, he was fascinated by how Zarossi had managed to convince so many people to trust him with their money, even while running a complete fraud. It was like a masterclass in manipulation, and Charles was taking notes. But Charles wasn't quite ready to graduate from this criminal education yet. Before leaving Canada, he decided to help himself to a little going-away present. He forged a check from one of the bank's clients for over $400. It should have been easy money, but Charles wasn't as clever as he thought. The bank teller immediately spotted the fake signature and called the police. 3 years in prison gave Charles plenty of time to think, but unfortunately, he didn't think about going straight. Instead, he spent his time plotting new ways to get rich without actually working for it. When he was released after 2 years, he immediately tried to smuggle 5 Italian immigrants into the United States, figuring it would be a quick payday. He got caught again, of course, and this time received another 2 years in federal prison. By the time Charles walked free for the second time, he was in his late 20s with 2 felony convictions and still no legitimate way to make a living. But sometimes life gives you exactly what you need when you least expect it. Back in Boston, Charles found work with an import-export company, and for once in his life, he was actually good at his job. Maybe prison had matured him, or maybe he was just tired of being broke and desperate. Whatever the reason, Charles not only kept this job but got promoted. Even better, he met Rose Necco, a 21-year-old woman who somehow saw past his criminal record and questionable employment history. Charles was so nervous during their first conversation that he could barely speak, but Rose was charmed by his awkwardness. They married in early 1918, and suddenly Charles had something he'd never experienced before: genuine happiness. But happiness wasn't enough for Charles. Even though Rose was perfectly content with their simple life, Charles had bigger dreams. He wanted to shower her with diamonds, fancy clothes, and expensive vacations. He wanted to prove that he could be the successful man he'd always believed himself to be. And a clerk's salary, no matter how steady, wasn't going to make that happen. 6 months after the wedding, Charles quit his job to pursue bigger opportunities. First, he joined his father-in-law's fruit business, confident that his supposed financial genius would turn the struggling company around. Instead, the business went bankrupt by the end of the year. Undeterred, Charles rented an office and started his own import-export business. But nobody took him seriously. He had no experience, no connections, and no credibility. When he realized how much it would cost to advertise his services, he had another brilliant idea. Why not start his own trade magazine and get other companies to pay him those same giant advertising fees? Charles called his publication The Trader's Guide and made incredibly ambitious plans. He would mail it free to 100,000 companies, doubling the circulation with each issue. According to his calculations, his first mailing would cost $35,000, but he'd make $80,000 in advertising revenue because companies would obviously be lining up to advertise in his magazine. The only problem? Nobody cared about Charles's obscure little trade publication. No companies wanted to advertise in it. When Charles went to the bank for a loan, the bank president refused so emphatically that he threatened to close Charles's account rather than lend him a single dollar. Once again, Charles found himself with a failed business, no money, and a growing sense of desperation. He had to fire his staff and sublet his office space just to pay the bills, but his dreams of wealth remained as strong as ever. Then, in August 1919, Charles received a letter that would change his life and make him infamous for the next century. A Spanish company had written to inquire about his trade magazine, and to pay for return postage, they'd included something Charles had never seen before: an international reply coupon. These coupons were simple enough. They could be purchased in any country and exchanged for postage stamps in any other country that belonged to the Universal Postal Union. People used them when sending international letters to cover the cost of the reply. But Charles saw something else entirely: an opportunity for arbitrage. Here's how Charles's brilliant plan was supposed to work. Because of currency fluctuations after World War I, these reply coupons cost different amounts in different countries, even though they could always be redeemed for the same value in postage stamps. So theoretically, Charles could buy coupons in Italy, where the currency had weakened, and redeem them in America for stamps worth slightly more in dollar terms. Then he'd sell the stamps for a tiny profit, scale this up to millions of coupons, and Charles figured he was looking at serious money. It seemed not just legal, but actually clever. Arbitrage was a legitimate investment strategy that had been used for centuries. Charles was convinced he'd found his golden goose. In January 1920, Charles started the Securities Exchange Company to handle his brilliant new business venture. On paper, everything looked perfect. But reality, as usual, had other plans. The truth was that the profits from arbitrage would be so small that they'd be completely wiped out by the costs of shipping coupons internationally. There literally weren't enough reply coupons in the entire world to sustain the kind of operation Charles was imagining. The whole thing was impossible from the start. But Charles refused to accept this. He was so convinced that this was his ticket to wealth that when the legitimate business proved unworkable, he decided to turn his idea into something else entirely: the most famous financial fraud in American history. Here's where Charles's story takes a dark turn. Instead of abandoning his impossible dream, he decided to convince other people that his plan would work and take their money. After all, his arbitrage story sounded really good, even though it was complete nonsense. The scheme Charles devised was elegantly simple. He would promise investors huge returns in impossibly short time periods: 50% profit in 45 days or 100% in 90 days. When people asked how this was possible, he'd explain his international reply coupon arbitrage operation, claiming he had agents all over the world buying coupons in bulk and shipping them to America. If anyone pressed for details, Charles would refuse to share them, claiming he couldn't reveal trade secrets that might help his competitors. It was a perfect excuse that made him sound protective of a legitimate business rather than evasive about a complete fraud. The beauty of Charles's approach was that he wasn't targeting sophisticated investors who might ask hard questions. He was going after people like himself, dreamers with more ambition than financial knowledge, people desperate for a way to get rich quick. He understood that his real talent wasn't in finance, but in reading people and telling them exactly what they wanted to hear. Charles started small, targeting people in his own neighborhood. He convinced 18 of them to invest in his first month. When he paid them their first round of profits using money from newer investors, word started spreading like wildfire. Soon, thousands of people were crowding the streets outside Charles's office, desperate to get in on what seemed like a sure thing. The psychological dynamics were perfect. Early investors were getting paid exactly as promised, so they told everyone they knew about this amazing opportunity. Many of them reinvested their profits to make even more money, and their testimonials convinced others that the whole thing was legitimate. Charles was taking in over $250,000 a day at the peak of his operation. The Boston Post called him a financial genius, which brought even more credibility and even more investors. Finally, Charles was able to live the life he'd always dreamed of: a mansion, expensive cars, fancy clothes, gold watches, diamond pins, and first-class travel everywhere. It was everything Charles had ever wanted, but it couldn't last. By the summer of 1920, less than 6 months after launching his scheme, cracks were starting to show. Initially, few people dared to question Charles because he'd successfully sued a financial analyst for libel after the man accused him of fraud. But journalists at the Boston Post, the same newspaper that had once celebrated him, decided to take a closer look at his operation. They brought in Clarence Barron, president of Dow Jones and manager of the Wall Street Journal, to analyze Charles's claims. Barron's calculations were devastating. Charles would have needed to purchase 160 million reply coupons to generate the profits he was claiming, but there were only 27,000 coupons in circulation worldwide. In July 1920, the Post published Barron's findings on the front page, calling Charles a fraud and prompting a government investigation. But Charles was a skilled manipulator, and he managed to ease official concerns by cooperating fully and even agreeing to stop taking new investments while under scrutiny. Then Charles made the mistake that would destroy him. He hired William McMasters as his publicist, thinking he needed someone to help manage his public image during the investigation. But McMasters was an honest man who quickly realized his client was a complete fraud. McMasters later said that Charles was a financial idiot who could hardly even add, spending his days sitting with his feet on his desk, smoking expensive cigars, and talking complete gibberish about postal coupons. With access to Charles's records, McMasters collected all the evidence he needed and wrote a devastating exposé for the Boston Post. This time, there was no escaping the truth. The Ponzi scheme collapsed almost overnight. Several banks had to declare bankruptcy. Tens of thousands of people lost their life savings. Charles himself was indicted on 86 counts of mail fraud, though he managed to plea bargain down to a single charge and received just 5 years in prison. You might think that prison would finally teach Charles his lesson, but you'd be wrong. After serving 3.5 years, he was released and immediately started planning another scam. Knowing that the government wanted to either deport him or imprison him again on outstanding charges, Charles fled to Florida. There, he started the Charpon Land Syndicate and tried to essentially repeat his original scheme with real estate. He promised investors 200% returns in just 60 days, claiming he was selling valuable property around Jacksonville. The only problem was that the land was worthless swampland. This time, though, Charles's reputation preceded him. His fraud was exposed quickly, and he faced being sent back to Massachusetts for a lengthy prison sentence. Desperate to escape, Charles disguised himself and tried to travel to Italy as a sailor on a cargo ship, but he was recognized and arrested in New Orleans. Charles spent another 7 years in prison. And the man who emerged was not the same confident schemer who had once charmed thousands of investors. He was broken, defeated, and had lost all the charisma that had made him so successful as a con man. Facing deportation to Italy, his wife chose to stay in America and divorced him. Charles spent his final years in poverty, living on memories of the brief time when he had been rich and famous. He ended up in Rio de Janeiro, where he died in 1949 in a charity hospital and was buried in a pauper's grave. But here's the thing that makes Charles Ponzi's story so fascinating and relevant even today. The psychological tricks he used are still being employed by fraudsters right now. The promise of impossible returns, the air of secrecy around the investment method, the targeting of people who are financially unsophisticated or desperate, the use of early investors as unwitting testimonials. These tactics work just as well today as they did a century ago. Charles understood something fundamental about human nature. People want to believe in shortcuts to wealth, especially when those shortcuts seem to be working for others. He knew how to present himself as reluctantly successful, as if he was doing investors a favor by letting them into his exclusive opportunity. The most chilling part of Charles's story isn't just the financial damage he caused, though that was enormous. It's how he preyed on people's dreams and desperation, how he turned their hopes into his personal enrichment, and how he showed absolutely no remorse for the thousands of lives he destroyed. Even after everything collapsed, Charles never seemed to fully grasp the human cost of his actions. He saw himself as a misunderstood genius rather than a predatory criminal. This delusion allowed him to keep trying the same basic scam over and over, always convinced that this time would be different. This time he'd finally achieve the lasting wealth and status he felt he deserved. The legacy of Charles Ponzi extends far beyond the financial fraud that bears his name. His story reveals uncomfortable truths about the persistence of get-rich-quick fantasies, the vulnerability of ordinary people to sophisticated manipulation, and the devastating consequences when charisma is used in service of greed rather than legitimate achievement. Today, we see Ponzi's techniques everywhere, in cryptocurrency scams promising impossible returns, in multi-level marketing schemes that recruit dreamers with more ambition than business sense, in investment frauds that use social media testimonials instead of newspaper articles to create credibility. The technology changes, but the fundamental psychology remains the same. People still want to believe that somewhere out there is a secret method for getting rich without working for it, and there are still predators ready to exploit that desire. Understanding Charles Ponzi's story isn't just about learning financial history. It's about recognizing the warning signs of fraud, understanding our own psychological vulnerabilities, and appreciating why legitimate wealth building is usually slow, boring, and requires actual work. Charles Ponzi thought the world owed him wealth and status simply because he wanted them badly enough. When legitimate paths to success proved too difficult or too slow, he chose to steal his fortune from people who trusted him. In the end, his inability to accept reality destroyed not only his victims' financial security, but his own life as well. The man who dreamed of returning to Italy as a rich success died alone and forgotten in Brazil. A cautionary tale about what happens when ambition becomes untethered from ethics, when charm is used as a weapon, and when the desire for easy money overrides basic human decency. Charles Ponzi's name lives on, but not in the way he hoped. Instead of being remembered as a financial genius, he's remembered as the patron saint of financial fraud. A reminder that if something sounds too good to be true, it probably is, and that the most dangerous lies are often the ones we want to believe.